have a feeling that some folks will join as we continue, but we'll go ahead and get started just to maximize everyone's time. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today, especially to our speakers. We are really appreciative of your time doing this presentation for the Land Trust community on the National Coastal Resilience Fund. You may have seen the disclaimer when you entered the Zoom meeting that this will be recorded. So anything you put in the chat box also will be recorded. We're gonna have a few speakers today. First, we'll have Jessica Granis from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then Dan Nees and Kyle Gray from Throwe Environmental doing an overview of this year's NCRF grant opportunity. Then we'll hear from Ruth with the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust on some successes and challenges of their NCRF project. And then we'll save quite a bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So throughout the presentation, feel free to put questions in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that and sort of helping to moderate that with our speakers at the end. So with that, I will start. Jessica, I've got your slides coming up.
Hi all, thanks for having me today. My name is Jessica Granis. I'm the Program Director for Coastal Resilience at NCRF, and I oversee the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So exciting to share this opportunity with you all today, and thanks for hosting us. Later, you're going to hear from Kyle Gray and Dan Nees with Throwe Environmental that serve as the field liaison team for the NCRF. So they are a good point of contact if you're looking for technical assistance on how to access the NCRF for projects that you're interested in putting forward. And then also it's a pleasure to share a Zoom screen with Ruth Indrick, one of our Land Trust grantees, who's going to share some of the lessons from her work in Maine. But I'm going to start giving you an overview of the NCRF. We did do a much longer webinar for the pre-proposal stage of the National Coastal Resilience Fund competition that's available on our website. We have a detailed FAQ document. All of the RFP language can be found on our website, but today I'll just give you a high-level overview, focusing on the program priorities, the eligibility criteria, the evaluation criteria our reviewers use, and some of the big changes we made to this year's RFP. And then I'm going to conclude with a couple examples of how land trusts have used NCRF funding in the past to catalyze some of their work. So what is the NCRF? What is the National Coastal Resilience Fund? It is one of many grant competitions that are run by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. It's an annual competition that we run. NCRF itself is a congressionally chartered 501(c) nonprofit foundation that was created by Congress to support public-private partnerships between federal agencies and the private sector in support of conservation and restoration initiatives. And in 2018, Congress created the National Coastal Resilience Fund here at NCRF with the aims of helping communities adapt to increasing risks from coastal flooding and erosion due to climate effects like rising sea levels and more intense storms. And this year, our program partners for the NCRF include NOAA, but other funding partners like the Department of Defense, Shell, Occidental, Transray, and we're also leveraging additional funding from the Bezos Earth Fund. So it's an exciting year for the NCRF. The purpose of the program is to support nature-based coastal resilience projects that really serve two goals. One is to reduce community exposure to coastal hazards such as flooding, erosion, and other climate stressors. And the second goal is to enhance habitat for fish and wildlife. Next slide. Here we have additional funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year. So we're going to be making approximately $140 million available to support coastal resilience projects in communities around the country. And as a result of that additional funding, we've made some changes to the way that we're administering the program including prioritizing larger scale projects that deliver bigger impacts on the ground in communities. And while we have no minimum or maximum amount that we have in terms of the grants that we'll issue, we're encouraging larger scale restoration implementation projects, and we'll fund upwards of a $10 million project or more. And one of the ways that we are encouraging this is by softening the match requirements. If you'd looked at the NCRF in past cycles, we historically have had a 1-to-1 match requirement. However, we recognize that that 1-to-1 match requirement was a barrier to larger scale, higher budget projects and projects that were advancing and meeting the needs of underserved communities. And so this year, we're encouraging match, and projects with higher match ratios will be more competitive, but there's no specific threshold of match that's going to be required. So that's one big change we've made this year. Next slide. So this slide shows the eligibility footprint for the NCRF. It is the National Coastal Resilience Fund, so we are focused on coastal areas, and we can fund in all coastal areas, including the Great Lakes territories and coastal tribal lands. And our eligibility boundary includes Huckate watersheds that drain to the ocean or adjacent Huckate watersheds that are tidally influenced or particularly low-lying. We have a map available on our website, which you can see here, that you can use to see if your project is within our eligibility boundaries, but note that this is a map for guidance purposes only. So if your project area meets the definition of a coastal area according to the RFP, but it's not shown in orange on our map, just feel free to still apply, and in your proposal narrative, describe how the project meets that definition. Slide. So one of the other interesting aspects of the NCRF is that we have broad flexibility in terms of the range of different entities that we can grant to. So we can grant to anything from a local, state, tribal, territorial government agency to nonprofit organizations, to universities, and up to for-profit institutions. So if you have contractors that you're working with and you prefer for them to be the lead, that is also an option. Ineligible applicants include federal agencies and federal employees, foreign organizations, and unincorporated individuals. Next slide. So the way that we fund within the NCRF is we're really trying to support and build up a pipeline of resilience projects. And each stage in our project pipeline is designed to get you to the next stage in your resilience efforts, with the goal of getting you to a restoration implementation project at the end, where you're implementing the restoration initiative and getting the outcomes for enhancing community resilience and improving habitat. So the first project category is our community capacity building and planning category. And here, these projects typically have robust community engagement. There are a broad suite of partners that are participating to ensure that the applicant has the capacity they need to plan and execute a variety of future resilience projects and other activities. And typically the output or deliverable here is a comprehensive resilience plan or plans that help you prioritize resilience projects in your community and address those coastal resilience challenges that you're facing. And we're really looking for plans that will help you advance to those restoration projects. So not plans that are going to sit on a shelf or research for research sake, but really plans that are going to be used and put into action by the community. And having a focus on natural and nature-based features will really help increase the competitiveness of your planning project. The second category is site assessment and preliminary design. And this is to get you to that next stage where you've identified priorities and you've identified projects that you think will help you address those community resilience challenges. And your next stage in development is conducting additional site assessment and completing preliminary design work to help you assess whether these projects are going to work. And so the output or deliverable here is typically a preliminary design that will help you make a go, no-go decision. So around that 30 to 60% design level. And then our third category is final design and permitting. This is where you've gone through your site assessment, you've prioritized your projects, and you really honed in on a site or two where you want to implement a project, and you're going to be working with an engineering firm to help you get to 90 to 100% design. And other activities that you can fund here is continuing your engagement with stakeholders, starting to have robust conversations with permitting officials so you can get those permits in hand, doing detailed cost assessments, and really positioning your project to be restoration ready. So ready for that next stage of implementation, which is our final category, which is restoration implementation. And this is where we're putting shovels in the ground and getting to construction. And so what we're looking for here is where projects are, pretty firm in terms of their design and engineering. And within 6 months of the start date, they'll have permits in hand and can start construction. And so eligible projects here include ecosystem restoration, construction of natural and nature-based features, and even green-gray hybrid infrastructure where you'll see those tangible community resilience and conservation outcomes, and they can be measured. Okay, so next slide. So what makes a project competitive? So there's full detailed evaluation criteria in the RFP itself. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that, but just a high-level overview of how our reviewers are looking at projects. The first thing is to be as specific as you can about your project and the specific benefits and that you anticipate from your project in terms of reducing risk from coastal hazards to communities and the habitat and species benefits that you expect. So be specific about roadways, schools, birds, fish, the community that will be benefited by these projects. And so that's the second point, is to be specific about the community. NIFWIF is prioritizing projects that benefit underserved communities. So tell us any risk factors in your community that make the community disproportionately vulnerable to disaster events, and provide specific demographic data about things like poverty rates and income levels that contribute to disproportionate risk. Community engagement is also something that we're really prioritizing across all project categories. So tell us about how you're going to be engaging community stakeholders and how they will be involved in the project's decision-making, development, design, and implementation. And then it's important to remember across all project categories that the project scale, the length of time, the requested budget all needs to be commensurate with the coastal resilience challenge that you're addressing through the work and the proposed scope of work that you're looking to fund. So next slide. There are a couple new things in the 2020 RFP and changes we've made with the additional funding that we received from the bipartisan infrastructure law. We talked about the revision to match. While there's no specific threshold of non-federal match that's required, match is still expected and encouraged. And we're reviewing that as one of our evaluation criteria to show that there's broad support for the project and that other stakeholders are putting in skin in the game to implement the project. But remember that match is not just cash. It includes in-kind donations, volunteer time, donated goods, services, and land. So if you all have received land that's been donated within the period of performance of this grant, that can be counted as match for your project. We're also entertaining project proposals where land acquisition or purchase of equipment is part of your budget request. And here we're really looking for projects, particularly for land acquisitions, where that acquisition is essential to implementing the broader coastal resilience project that you want to implement, and where there are no other funding sources that are really available to support or complete the acquisition. If you have a project where you're requesting funding for land acquisitions and you'd like to explore this as a funding source, there is a separate upload that you will need to complete that talks about the need, that talks about how it will contribute to the broader coastal resilience initiative that you're looking to implement, and talks about sort of the status of the negotiations, where your project stands. And then we also have additional funding this year from our partners at the Department of Defense through their Reppy program. So if you have projects that benefit or adjacent to military facilities where you want to implement a resilience project, there is additional funding that the DoD is contributing. So there's also a separate one-page upload there to talk about how the project will contribute to military resilience. So the next slide is our timeline. We released the RFP late in March. Pre-proposals are due next week on April 21st. We will be inviting full proposals at the end of May, and then full proposals will be due at the end of June. We're looking to announce and get grants approved at our November board meeting. So that's our timeline. And then a couple examples in our next slide of how a couple of our land trust grantees have used NIFWIF funding to support their coastal resilience initiatives. One example is from the would-be Kaimeno Land Trust. They received a $155,000 grant from NCRF to support a feasibility study where they're exploring possible land acquisition and restoration potential for 292 acres of diked farmland on the island. And the project will assess the potential to restore these acquired parcels to enhance flood resilience for residents and to improve habitat for salmon and other wildlife. And then our next slide is an example of a land trust municipal partnership. So the Carmel River Floodplain Restoration and Environmental Enhancement Initiative in California is a final design and permitting project where the County of Monterey is partnering with the Big Sur Land Trust. They are working on the final design to restore 100 acres of farmland that was donated to the land trust, to restore lagoon and floodplain habitat within the lower Carmel River. And the project will reduce flooding for residents and improve habitat for special status species and steelhead trout. So those are a couple of our examples. And now I'm going to turn it over to our field liaisons who are going to talk to you about how to access Throwe Environmental's technical assistance. They serve as our field liaisons for the NCRF. Kyle and Dan.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. So you all just heard from Jessica Granis. She is in charge of the National Coastal Resilience Fund program at the Fish and Wildlife Foundation. But Dan and myself, our team at Throwe Environmental, we all serve as field liaisons for this program. So we've been contracted out by the foundation to support the NCRF and potential applicants through outreach. We provide feedback on project ideas, and we really just work to make folks more competitive as they come into this program. So over the next few slides, I'll show you how we go about doing that, and then just give you some tips and some pointers that we've gathered as we've started to support this program. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll see, a little bit more clarity around what Throwe Environmental's role actually is. So very broadly, we promote climate resilience and coastal resilience through this program by doing outreach across the country. So that map that you saw that Jessica had put up earlier with the orange footprint of the program that's nationwide, we've been able to conduct outreach and host webinars, tap into listservs, have one-on-one meetings with folks all across the country. And really, we can do that to spread word about the program, but what's most important is providing feedback on potential project ideas. So as folks start to brainstorm around an idea that they may eventually be interested in submitting, or as they actually work to develop that idea into a pre-proposal, we serve as a kind of a good middle ground point between the applicant and the foundation to help that idea become more competitive and to help fill it out a little bit more. We can also offer follow-up for proposals that were not selected for funding. So if you apply to this program and you either don't make it through the pre-proposal or the full proposal stage, again, we can provide some feedback on what we saw based on, any ideas that you have for the project. Could be more competitive in the next round of funding, or where we just see, room to make a proposal more competitive. And then lastly, we also can come in to support existing grantees as they, navigate the program and actually complete a project that was proposed. So for folks who are interested, we have our website here at the bottom that gives a little bit more information about the work that we've done. We have some webinars that are recorded. All of that is available on the Throwe Environmental website. And I'll also make sure we give out our emails towards the end. So if we can go to the next slide. Just wanted to cover a couple tips or tricks, kind of best practices, as you work to put together or think through ideas for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So first and foremost, before you even have an idea written up, it's obviously critical to develop that idea into something that will be suitable for this program. So some key considerations to think about, right from the get-go are, first, what are the coastal hazards that your project is addressing? So here we think about things like flooding, erosion, sea and lake level change, all of those hazards that Jessica had mentioned earlier. Knowing what those are and how your project would respond to those hazards is critical in putting together an application. Next, of course, this is the Coastal Resilience Fund with the Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So there really have to be strong dual benefits here. You're looking for benefits to community resilience and critical infrastructure and lifelines that the community will rely on, as well as benefits to valuable fish and wildlife habitat. And as you put together a project idea that will support those dual benefits, it's important to think early on what the nature-based solutions are that will be, key to that project. Of course, we mentioned earlier that scale and transferability are key in this program. So thinking about how you can address a coastal hazard or a challenge at scale and transfer those ideas across a region or across a community. And the last point here is benefits to underserved communities. So that's becoming increasingly important in this fund. So knowing who those underserved communities are, making sure we're engaging them at every step of the way, getting that meaningful level of engagement, all that is critical. So as you start to develop your idea, it's also great to know early on which project phase or category you'd be falling into. So this is a program where you'd fit rather neatly in one of those 4 categories that Jessica had brought up. We're not looking to straddle categories here, really looking to fit into one spot in that pipeline to work towards implementation. And then lastly, as you work to develop a plan for success, you're putting together your proposal idea, you're developing out your goals and your objectives, or before you start writing, that's a great point to connect with our team for feedback. We can kind of be that early stopping point to help you, go in the right direction and make sure that you're really being as competitive as possible when submitting a grant to this program. So on the next slide, you'll see some tips while you're actually putting together a proposal. So of course, this goes for any proposal that would be out there regardless of program, but writing will set the tone. So it's important very early on in the proposal to not just demonstrate your need, but to demonstrate how the funding source will help you address that need. With the pre-proposal especially, you've only got 2 pages here for a narrative, so it's important to be clear and concise and to make sure you're selling the folks that are actually reviewing the pre-proposal on your project, right? You're trying to market your idea, trying to convince them, what the need is and how that funding will address the need. So making sure that you're thinking kind of how the reviewer would think is important. Equally important here is becoming familiar with the grant software that the foundation uses to submit applications. So it's called Easy Grants. The link right here is Easy Grants, or the email link is easygrants@nfwif.org. And there's also a phone number on screen for the Easy Grants help desk. So as you work to submit and upload materials for this program, knowing where the resources are on that, being able to reach out to the Easy Grants help desk, all of that will be important should you run into any issues with the software itself. And on the next slide, you'll see just some kind of final things to think about as you prepare to submit your application. So of course, reread it, revise it, take a break for a minute, take a step back, get a fresh pair of eyes to look at it. compare it back to the RFP, the FAQ that's available from the program, and really look at the priorities that the program is focusing on, as well as the evaluation criteria that will be used to actually, score your application. The more feedback you can get here, that always tends to be best. And lastly, you want to bundle this as, a good way to sell this project. So putting together a strong title and a strong abstract that casts your project in a good light always tends to be beneficial. And like I mentioned, if you don't get funded, that's okay. We are here as field liaisons as a resource for you all to continue working through ideas. This fund operates on an annual basis. So as you think through a project idea again, you might be able to reapply the following year. So I think we only have one more slide if we can switch to that. And that should just be, the slide with our email here. So if you have any questions about the program itself, how you go about navigating it, or really just to discuss any project ideas that you have, whether they're at the brainstorming stage or you're practically ready to submit a pre-proposal, we are here as that resource. So you can email us at info@throwe-environmental.com, and we will make sure, we get a call scheduled, get you the resources that you need to provide feedback on a proposal and to help make you as successful as possible in this program. So with that, I will turn it over. I believe Ruth is next. So I will pass it over to Ruth.
Ruth, did you want to do your own slides, or would you like me to share my screen?
I can share screen if that works. Thank you. All right, does that look great? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm Ruth Indrick. I'm the project director at the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, and Chelsea had asked me to share our project as an example of a land trust-led project that received funding from NCRF from their foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund. So our project is focused on restoration and resilience at the Back River Creek Tidal Marsh in Woolwich, Maine. So before I jump into the project, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background information about our land trust. I know for me, it's always helpful to have a sense of the size and scope of other land trusts that are presenting out projects and kind of figure out how our land trust fits in there. So we were founded in 1989. We're located in southern Midcoast, Maine. We have 5 staff members, and our primary service area spans 9 communities. So before we applied for our project, our region was actually part of one of NCRF's early regional coastal resilience assessments. So for that, they mapped areas that they identified as resilience hubs. So now there's the CREST tool, and I think that there are resilience hubs mapped throughout the country. So you should be able to check out your area on the map. So the maps were really useful, but what was most useful about this process was really just thinking about all the pieces that went into the resilience hub classification. So that's shown on the really neat diagram from their 2019 report. So resilience hubs are those areas where there's overlap between open space and fish and wildlife habitat, as well as that high value community infrastructure assets. So in our part of coastal Maine, a lot of good projects that seem to meet those dual purpose of increasing resilience for fish and wildlife, as well as human communities, were projects that address tidal restrictions. So for our project, we had 2 goals that really fit into that duality of increasing resilience for people and fish and wildlife. So for goal 1, we were striving for a functioning marsh and fish passage. Upstream from the tidal restriction, there's about 140 acres of marsh. So you can see just the edge of it in this aerial photo. And then the undersized culverts are very undersized. They lead to really high velocity flows. And so that limits the ability of fish to travel upstream. So we had extra stream miles fish could access and acres of marsh that could be restored through our project. And so then for goal 2, that really focused in more on the critical infrastructure. So at this site, the biggest piece of infrastructure at risk is US Route 1. It's the major coastal road in Maine. It has huge amounts of cars traveling it on it every day. And you can see that there's already during storm tides flooding in this section of the road. An additional piece of infrastructure that was critical for the region is a water main pipe that leads from a lake to the east to a town and communities on the west. And so about 15,000 people depend on the water that flows through this pipe. So we applied for this project in 2018 and the work began in 2019. So this was, I think, the first round of the National Coastal Resilience Fund. And at that point, there were only 2 grant categories. So those first 3 steps were crammed into the design and permitting. And we applied for that category. We had interested stakeholders, but we had a lot of work to do to try and get everybody on the same page. So our feasibility study included stakeholder meetings and conversations. We did a lot of environmental monitoring, assessing the site, understanding baseline conditions. We did a geotechnical assessment of the site, worked with an engineer to develop a hydrologic and hydraulic model of the site. And then there were engineering designs completed or the goal is to have engineering designs completed for 4 pieces of infrastructure. So I just made a note that as a part of your application, you'll need to fulfill a couple different metrics. And so one metric that we fulfilled for this project was the number of engineering designs that we developed. And I also wanted to note that for us, a big piece of this project, at that point, there was a 50% requirement for match, was having a project partner that was able to provide that local match. So Maine Department of Transportation partnered with us on the project. This was an important site for them. And it also, for them, worked out well because they typically get most of their local matches federal money from federal highways. And so this was access for them to a non-traditional source of federal funding that could support local infrastructure. So for this project, the main role of our land trust was really as the coordinator. So going into it, we already had relationships with state agencies, with local nonprofits, with federal agencies. We worked with the utility on a fish passage, fish ladder reconstruction project. We knew the local residents. We worked with the select board members and the town government. So we were really able to help coordinate and connect all of these players together and get the conversations going about the project. We also did grant management. We contracted with some of the pieces of the project, and we assisted with some of the monitoring. And then I just wanted to note in our application, the second metric that we reported was the number of organizations that we collaborated with to contribute towards the goal. And so we collaborated with 13 organizations on this project. Because our project was for planning and design, we didn't have any metrics associated with number of acres or stream miles fixed, because those metrics are associated with implementation projects. So monitoring before and after the project is a really important piece of the grant requirements. And so that's why I wanted to just mention what we did. I think we went beyond what would be required for the grant, but it was really helpful for us to do this monitoring. It helped us to evaluate the current conditions of the site. It also helped us to predict how the site would change if we changed the tidal barriers. And so it contributed to our designs. And we had some really great partners that we worked with for the monitoring. We were able to use some of the grant funds to contract with them and support their funding needs to enable them to help us learn all of these great things about the site. So I do have to admit that we have definitely had some challenges along the way. Some of the decisions and conversations about the project took longer than expected. Our different engineering designs, we thought we could work on all of them at once, and really we found like we needed to get one piece done and then we could work on the next piece. So everything has taken longer. We haven't finished our project yet. We're still working on it. We also needed to change some small components of the project, like some of our cost estimates. And so for both of these things, the staff at NIFWIF was very responsive. We were able to meet and have conversations with them and figure out how to extend our timeline and also make changes to the budget that moved some funds that were allocated to something that came in under cost to a piece of the project that the cost was much more than we had budgeted for. And I also did want to note that as you're putting together your project budgets, one thing that we found is that the grant reporting, the expense tracking, it really does take time. So I would recommend that you allocate some staff time for that background work, and that would be helpful. So where we're at now, we made it to the point in our project where the state infrastructure components have final designs and they were able to get construction funding. So that is underway now. This was a picture of the site yesterday. So they're out there starting work on the site, which is really exciting. We're still working on conceptual designs and final designs for the town and water district infrastructure, but that is slowly eking forward. And we're also nearing the point where we'll be able to apply for construction funds for the remaining pieces of the work. So that's it for my presentation. And I just wanted to thank all of our partners on the project, as well as the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for helping us to get this project going.
Awesome. Thanks, Ruth. That was extremely enlightening. I know for me, that was sort of the first NCRF project I've kind of been walked through. So that was really helpful. If there are questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or given that I don't see any there now, if you have questions and want to just unmute yourself and ask aloud, that would also be most welcome. Let's see, there's a question in the chat from Vance. Says the RFP and a few comments noted that proposals should be very specific about the local benefits, threats, etc., but also consider scale and transferability. If we are requesting funding for site assessment and due diligence for multiple projects across a broad coastal landscape, should we submit numerous applications or just one large application? And would a small project not have the needed scale, or would multiple projects not have enough of a localized and specific benefit given the landscape conservation focus? Sorry, that was a very long question.
And just like any good lawyer, I think the answer is it depends. I think, given what you've laid out, it sounds like you are doing similar activities in terms of the project category. And so if you're at that site assessment and preliminary design stage and you have multiple sites across a landscape and you get a more appropriate scale for the coastal hazard by working at multiple sites in the landscape, I would look at submitting one proposal and talking about how the different project sites within that landscape get you to the scale that is needed for the coastal resilience challenges that you're facing. If, however, your project's sites are at different stages in terms of implementation, so if one's more at a preliminary design, you're looking to collect that baseline monitoring. If you're more in a final design at other stages, then you might think about implementing two different projects, and in your proposals talking about the nexus and links between the two proposals. However, we do want to see that you would have the capacity to implement two different projects in the same watersheds.
Karen's asking about Reppy and if initiatives with funding from Reppy are eligible for this funding opportunity.
Do you have existing Reppy dollars that you're, yes. Yeah, I don't see how having an existing Reppy grant would necessarily detract from your proposal. I would just talk about if there is a link between what you're doing with your existing Reppy funds and what you want to do through the NCRF Reppy partner funding. I would talk about how that, the work that you've previously funded under Reppy is setting the stage for this larger initiative that you'd like to fund through the NCRF.
Thank you.
Other questions? I'm wondering if everyone is can access their reactions button. If I could just get a show of hands for folks that are thinking about submitting an application or a pre-proposal for this funding opportunity. See one. A few. Nice. Okay, great. I have a question, Jessica. If just sort of about the different sort of stages of funding and different pots of funding, for example, could you know, a land trust with other community partners kind of submit applications in multiple years and multiple different stages for the same project, or you know, continuation of the same project? Is that something that has happened in the past, or that NIFWF is open to?
Yes, we encourage our applicants to come back to us to fund future stages of project implementation. And I think Ruth was alluding to the fact that maybe she's ginning up a proposal for us for this round to support implementation of the work that she did with preliminary or final design and permitting. And I think one of the other things that that other grantees have used our funds for is somewhat catalytic to help them access other federal funding sources. So because NIFWF has more flexibility than some of our federal partners to fund nonprofits and, you know, other university partners, whereas federal grants sometimes can only go to state and local governments. Some of our grantees have used that fund to start to do the preliminary design, the planning work that's needed to get them access to larger federal funding sources. Like a big one that many of our grantees are working on is to get funding from FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program. So, you know, think about this as a potential way to do some of the early stages of project development and design that may open your project up to other funding sources. One of the other things that we do here at NIFWF is the NCRF is one of many programs that we administer. And so as we're evaluating proposals, we're always looking across our funding portfolio and helping grantees access other funding sources when their project may not be the best fit for NCRF, but could be funded through our Chesapeake program, for example, helping applicants navigate the offerings that we have here at NIFWF as well.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Anyone else have questions? I'm thinking specifically of those of you that are maybe submitting or thinking of submitting pre-proposals soon. Are there specific questions that you have that can help to guide your process?
I have a question, Chelsea. So is this an annual offering? Do you envision this being open every year, kind of around the same time with similar funding levels, or what are your projections for the future on this program?
So it was created in 2018, and we've had typically our annual cycle has been between $33 and $40 million annually. With the bipartisan infrastructure law, we were appropriated $492 million over the next 5 years. So we're anticipating similarly elevated funding levels over the next 5 grant cycles. You know, what happens after that 5-year cycle, you know, we all have to read the tea leaves, but you know, this is an annual program. We anticipate having an annual competition of differing funding levels, and anticipate similarly elevated funding levels over the next 5 years. And we tried to stick to a very similar timeline, releasing the RFP in March timeframe, and then trying to bring a slate of proposals to our board to approve in November of every.
Great question, Kelly. Looks like Kira has a question, wondering a little more about the new updated guidelines regarding land acquisitions.
So land acquisitions are a new eligible use for the NCRF. There are, as you all probably know better than I do, significant administrative hurdles that you need to jump through to acquire lands with federal dollars. So we're navigating how to implement those kinds of activities through the NCRF. The kind of two criteria that we're really looking at here as we evaluate proposals seeking funding for land acquisitions is that for the acquisition, you wouldn't be able to implement a broader coastal resilience initiative. So we're really looking at projects where you really need to acquire those parcels to help you implement a restoration project that's going to deliver those dual benefits in terms of community and habitat resilience. And then the other thing we're really looking at is that there are no other federal funding sources available to support land acquisition. So in your there's a one-page upload if you're looking to explore the opportunities to use NCRF money to support an acquisition. I would talk about the different funding sources that you have looked at and are considering in your transaction. We recognize that land transactions, you're often stacking different funding sources together to get to the total price that you need to acquire the land. So if there's a delta that you need above the funding sources you've explored, talk about that in your pre-proposal, talk about the need for acquiring the property and what you're going to do with it in terms of implementing those broader coastal resilience projects. And then talk to us about the stage of the transaction. Where are you at in terms of your negotiations with landowners? Where are you at in terms of pulling together the various different funding sources you need to complete the transaction? We want to understand where in the stage you are. And I think, in terms of where this fits into our project pipeline, this is the first year we're doing this, so we're still trying to work out the kinks. But I think we're expecting most projects to be at that final design and permitting stage or the restoration and implementation stage, like where you're kind of ready to make the transaction happen, make the deal happen and start restoration, or you're at earlier stages in the negotiations, but you're oh.
Awesome. Thanks. Any other questions for Jessica, or Kyle, or Ruth?
Hi, Karen again. Jessica, thank you so much. This is so helpful. And forgive me because I'm on my week 2 of a brand new job with the land trust. So this is so exciting, but I'm very familiar with NCRF. I think we might have a really good opportunity if we could pull it together quickly enough, but we do have Reppy funding, and I think that it will be most relevant to that. So the handout that you're mentioning in the application that talks about going through the other federal funding sources, is that something that we could see, or do you have to get really into the application process? Because I think if we could take a look at that at our organization, I could see what shape we're in.
Yeah, so you do need to set up an account on Easy Grants. You need to set up your user profile and your organizational profile and start to set up your NCRF grant. And then once you're in Easy Grants and you've set up the NCRF application, you'll be able to download both the pre-proposal narrative as well as those special questions for the Reppy funds and for acquisitions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And the kind of guidance for the Reppy funds and the acquisitions are also, the language is included in the RFP itself. So you can also look there.
Oh, good. Okay.
Guidance.
Thanks.
I have a question, and Jessica, you might not be able to answer this, and apologies if I'm putting you on the spot, but I saw yesterday that the America the Beautiful Challenge was announced, that there be sort of a new grant program at NCRF, but wondering if there's any tie-in with NCRF, or if there's potential that this could all sort of be lumped into one larger grant program going forward under this challenge, or if you have anything you can say about that. I know it was just announced yesterday and there's still a lot of kinks to work out, but I'm curious.
So NCRF will probably not ever come under the America the Beautiful initiative, just because that's associated with the kind of infrastructure law and implementing some of the funding that was more of a one-time appropriation under that law, where the NCRF is an annual, congressionally created fund. So we're keeping those separate, but we are definitely working closely with our, program partners here at NIFWF to make sure that we're looking for opportunities and synergies across programs, to look at co-funding opportunities. So there's opportunities through our Chesapeake Bay program or our Great Lakes program to co-fund projects that have that coastal resilience nexus. Or like I said earlier, where we get a proposal in through NCRF, but really it might be a better fit for something that's being funded through the America the Beautiful initiative, making those connections for applicants so they know how to best access the resources that NIFWF has available to support the important work that they're leading. So more to come on that. We're anticipating the RFP for that initiative to be released in May. We're working on it.
Great, thanks. That was really helpful. And I'm just going to post the sort of like press release in the chat if folks want to take a look at that, just so you have it on your radars and you're sort of looking out for that next month. This could be also a great opportunity for land trusts, but we'll have to wait and see a few more details on that. Are there any other questions for our speakers today? Or also for myself or Kelly at the Land Trust Alliance? Okay. Well, with that, I want to just say thanks to Jessica, Kyle, Dan, and Ruth for joining us. We really appreciate your time. For any land trust folks on the call, if you do decide you want to submit a pre-proposal or you're thinking of applying, definitely reach out and let me know. I'd love to provide any support that I can, and would just love to kind of keep tabs on who's applying, and if we can be of any help, reach out and let me know. Thanks, everyone.